When do you think we might know what world we're living in, whether that's a Biden landslide, a Trump win, or a contested election?
We'll know pretty soon on election night. I think by midnight, we should have a good sense as to, as you said, which world we live in. A lot of this depends on results from Florida and North Carolina, which we should know by the end of the night. But even in the states that are not competitive, places like Texas and Ohio, we'll have some nuggets of information as to whether this is a sort of wave the election for one or the other candidate, or whether it's going to go into overtime in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan.
To take it back a step, let's establish why 2020 is different from past elections, where we normally do see a result on the night, even if it's very late. I suppose the question this time is all these different types of votes that people have to count, mail-in ballots, early ballots, as well as votes on the day. Which part of that chain do you think is going to cause the most friction?
The mail-in ballots are really the distinctive feature of this election. So over 82 million Americans have requested or will receive mail-in ballots. And that's double what we've had in the past. And it's not just the number of mail-in ballots, but it's the states that are increasing their mail ballot usage. So places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina don't have an extensive experience with mail-in balloting. So it's going to take them some time to finish the count.
We know that other states in America have had a long history of, adequately conducting the whole process through mail-in ballots. But as you say, there's newcomers, particularly Pennsylvania, that politically is really important. How confident are you, given what you've seen over the years, that this system can cope?
Well, there are new challenges, that's for sure. But in some ways, we don't have a lot of choice here. I mean, we need to move to voting with social distance, and the most distant way for people to vote is to vote from home. But they will have ample polling places as well. I think Pennsylvania, in particular, is going to have some challenges. Michigan also has said that they won't release the results until about Friday of next week. And Wisconsin suggests that they'll actually have results within 48 hours or so. But I'm confident that the election officials are prepared for this. They've been preparing all summer. To some extent, the best thing that happened was that the pandemic happened during the primary elections, so you could have a dry run through and have all the mistakes made then as opposed to on election day. But there's no question that there's some significant stress being put on election officials in this election.
So let's paint a picture of election night itself. And we might actually have a sort of false dawn with a result, mightn't we? Because we might see all of the on-the-day votes going to one candidate and then the trickle in of the mail-in ballots over several days, which changes the outcome. So how on earth do TV networks or anybody call the election?
Yeah, most of what we've been talking about these days is a so-called red mirage followed by a blue wave or a blue shift, where the election day vote would heavily favor President Trump, and then the absentee ballots would later favor Joe Biden. That's actually not exactly what I think is going to happen, because there are some places like Arizona and Florida where they will count and release the earliest vote totals, including the absentee ballots, before they do the election day returns. And so we may have a blue mirage followed by a red mirage followed by a blue shift. But the general point is right, which is that the absentee ballots are going to be heavily favoring the Democrats here. In some states, it's twice, 2-to-1 advantage on the absentee ballots. And so the networks have to contextualize these results and to be clear that the early results are not predictive of the final outcome.
How likely do you think we'll have a Bush-Gore-like scenario that we saw in 2000 in Florida? Because both teams are legaling up, aren't they? There's already more than 100 cases going through the courts.
Yes, well, there's well over 300 cases that have gone through the courts at this point, if you include everything from the primaries to today, because there are new legal issues that the pandemic is posing. The question as to whether we will have another Bush versus Gore really just depends on the margin, right? So in a close election where one state is going to be outcome determinative, then yes, we have a Bush versus Gore situation. The polls right now don't suggest that, but we've known that the polls have been wrong before, and most notably 4 years ago. And so no one is taking anything for granted right now. So in order to have a Bush versus Gore scenario, it has to be a close election coming down to one state with sort of clear legal issues that will decide the outcome. So the nightmare scenario that a lot of people think about is a close election that comes down to Pennsylvania where the absentee ballots are determinative. Now, again, that is a low probability event, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. And I think that we should be prepared for that possibility that there will be legal wrangling after Election Day.
Let's talk about that crisis scenario. President Trump has talked extensively about mail-in ballots and being, voter fraud, illegitimacy of ballots counted after Election Day. We know that Pennsylvania has through the week to count some of these ballots that aren't cast on the day. So is there a world in which legal challenges are successful in actually stopping any counting beyond election night and kind of throws the whole result into the air?
Well, it depends what the objections are. So it's too difficult right now to figure out what the legal vehicle would be to try to stop the counting of absentee ballots. Presumably, there would be allegations of fraud, as you said, and they've been seeding that argument already in the pre-election period. And the argument would be there's something inherently tainted about the absentee ballots. But it's not as if this is the first election that might be decided by absentee ballots. We have experience, we have precedent in how to deal with this. There are state laws that provide for recounts. And so there will be a legal process in Pennsylvania or elsewhere to determine the legality of voters and ballots.
Each state has its own quirks when it comes to the way that they're both processing and delivering, of course, the different pieces of paper for people to vote on. So with the 2000 election, it was the hanging chads. We're looking at naked ballots this time in Pennsylvania. What have you seen that you're either heartened or concerned by? Because anecdotally, I've got neighbours, for instance, in DC who say they've received ballots for 4 previous residents in the property, which is a worry, right?
Well, receiving more ballots is not necessarily a problem if those voters are ineligible and are not going to have their vote counted. I mean, there is a process for verifying the identity of voters when they return their mail ballots. We have, if you go to healthyelections.org, we have an entire signature matching memo there, so you can see how different jurisdictions match signatures in order to prevent fraud. But it's not just the issue of signature matching that's just top of mind, right? One of the things that I think we should be concerned about is the number of ballots that will be received too late to be counted. It's going to be in the hundreds of thousands. That's one of the reasons you've seen all this action at the U.S. Supreme Court in this final week over the deadlines, is because we know that because of postal delays and other things, that there are going to be hundreds of thousands of ballots that will not be arriving. But related to that, and just the general sort of challenge with this election, is you have millions of voters who have never voted a mail ballot before, who are for the first time having to navigate that process. And while over a series of elections you can figure it out, for a lot of people, they might find it surprising that you have to sign the outside of a ballot because they thought it was anonymous, or they might not know what the deadlines are, or some of the other technicalities, like you mentioned, naked ballots, the idea that you have to have a secrecy sleeve inside an envelope in order for a ballot to count in Pennsylvania. Those are all new processes for people to work through.
What does it take if this all kind of falls apart through Wednesday, Thursday next week? What does it take for the Supreme Court to get involved, as they did famously in 2000? Is that kind of weeks of wrangling away before it gets to that stage?
Well, it probably will be at least a week or two. It depends on what the nature of the controversy is, right? Because right now we're sort of speculating that it would follow the same path or playbook as Bush versus Gore. But there are a lot of other things that could happen. We could have issues with violence in polling places. We could have issues with destruction of ballots. I mean, there's all kinds of pathologies that we as election law experts look at. If it comes to absentee ballots, then there will be a week or two of the counting and processing and verification of the absentee ballots. And then if it's still close, then there'll be challenges to those absentee ballots and then a recount following along the lines of Bush versus Gore. It would go through the state system and then end up at the Supreme Court.
We know back in 2000 that the state attorney general there, a Republican, played a role. We know that the Republicans were very quick to try and steer the narrative. And there was a concern that Al Gore had sort of lost the political wins because of that early concession, and he never really made it back. So in the eyes of many in the public, he was a sore loser, if you like. Do you think that's what we'll see if it's contested this time, is both teams really trying to very quickly leap on the stories so that neither can be suggested as a loser in this scenario?
I think the most important factor is who is perceived as being ahead as we approach the legal wrangling, right? And if you talk to the lawyers for the Bush administration, or the Bush campaign at the time, they'll say that they were constantly looking at the bottom of the TV, which would always say 500 votes ahead or 2,000 votes ahead. And so long as you maintain that advantage, in public perception, it's seen as you are ahead and the other candidate is trying to take that away from you. So I think that is quite important. So it is possible that we will see false claims of victory with partial results on election night or shortly thereafter.
What's the impact, do you think, potentially, of the Supreme Court shift recently, obviously with Amy Coney Barrett appointed to the Supreme Court? She actually recused herself this week from 2 cases that were going through the courts, but Conservatives have a 6-3 majority now. What might that mean for Team Trump when they're looking at this?
Well, what we've seen in these early cases is that there have been situations in which the court has been divided 4-4, with Chief Justice Roberts joining the 3 more liberal justices in order to keep in place state court decisions that were sort of pro-voting rights, relaxing the deadlines and the like. And so she could be a critical tie-breaking vote in these cases, and the question is going to be how strictly to interpret state laws, to what extent will you give deference to state courts as opposed to state legislatures. And so I think this appointment at this time, if she participates in these cases, could be quite significant.
I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball here. The question which lots of listeners ask us is, what happens if Trump refuses to leave the White House? He is, if the blue shift through next week changes the outcome and we feel that we have a President Biden by the end of next week, what does Trump do?
Well, we don't really know. The Constitution assumes a peaceful transfer of power. It doesn't provide for it. And so ever since George Washington, we've had peaceful transfers of power. Now, on January 20th, if President Trump has lost the election, he loses authority as president. He can still, even if he's in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House, it doesn't mean he is still president. The authority then goes to Vice President Biden. But at that point, we would be a new constitutional territory here, how that would be navigated, what role the courts would play, how the military would pay attention to conflicting orders, right? That's something that really is for another day for us to figure out. Let's hope that we're not there.
December the 8th, though, is a key date, isn't it, in all of this? Tell us a little bit about that.
So there are a few key dates in thinking about this election. Obviously, November 3rd, when we finish casting ballots. December 8th is what's known as the safe harbor deadline of the Electoral Count Act, which basically says that if a state has gotten all of its ballots counted or have finished its election, made its choice by that date, that the candidate who won by that date will be the presumptive victor of the Electoral College votes from that state. And then the Electoral College meets a week later on December 14th, where they will, in each of the states, sort of declare who they have voted for. If there is still a controversy, for example, if in a state you have different bodies that send different slates of electors, that gets resolved at the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate on January 6th with the newly elected House and Senate. And they're constitutionally vested with the power to determine between conflicting slates of electors. There's something that's called the election administrator's prayer, and that is, oh God, whatever happens, please don't let it be close. and that's because if it's a close election, then all the frailties of the electoral system then come into full bloom and are seen as outcome determinative. And so hopefully we'll have a clear outcome where we'll know who won on election day.
And it is worth saying, I think, that there are states which are good at counting their absentee ballots and their early votes and might bring up, they're crucial, decisive states that might bring us a result. So if, for example, Joe Biden is doing really well in Florida, Arizona, and North Carolina, all of which are good at doing this stuff quickly, we might actually know on the night. It's not kind of guaranteed disaster, is it?
That's right. And we might not know who actually won those states at that point. We might know who is ahead. And based on the data that we have early on November 3rd, we might be able to make inferences about the likelihood as to whether it's a blowout or whether it's going to be a close outcome.
Nate Persily, thank you so much for talking us through quite a complicated tapestry of stuff, and enjoy election night.
Thank you.